ABC Thursdays.
Welcome back.
Grey's Anatomy is all new.
Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant?
The drama going down
Bungee jumping from the bridge, his cord snapped.
We need all hands on deck.
is unbelievable.
You think you're God's gift to this hospital? You're just another doctor.
My relationship with Catherine is complicated.
I'm gonna sue you.
Your lawyers know where to find me.
You're unbelievable.
Grey's Anatomy. All new Thursdays, 10/9 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. The town of Malden, Massachusetts, in the early 1980s was the kind of New England community that seemed to resist the passage of time. A densely packed suburb north of Boston, it held a familiar rhythm. Children walking to school under the spreading canopies of maple trees in the fall, families gathering on porches in the summer evenings, and neighbors greeting each other as they went about their daily lives. It was a place where families were close-knit and where institutions, churches, schools, businesses, they were all part of the social fabric, offering a sense of stability and security to those who called it home. Amid this comfortable routine stood the Fells Acres Day School, a small family-run daycare center that had been serving the Malden community since 1966. Located in a cozy, unassuming building on a tree-lined street, it was owned and operated by Violet Amirault, a kindly, grandmotherly figure who had built the daycare into a trusted and beloved institution. Violet's son, Gerald Tukey Amirault, and her daughter, Cheryl Amirault Lefave, both worked at the daycare alongside her, helping to care for the many children who passed through its doors. Parents, many of them working-class families who depended on the daycare for their children's care while they worked, were grateful for the Amirault's dedication and trustworthiness. But in the summer of 1984, the peace and quiet of Fells Acres and the entire community of Malden was shattered when a series of accusations emerged. Accusations so shocking, so horrifying, that they would leave an indelible mark not only on the lives of the Amirault family, but also on the entire nation. What began as a single complaint by one mother spiraled into a full-blown moral panic, fueled by sensationalized fears of satanic ritual abuse and the flawed methods of law enforcement and psychology. The Fells Acres case became one of the most infamous legal sagas of the 1980s, a chilling reminder of how fragile truth can be in the face of collective hysteria. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Fells Acres, Terror in New England. As I was closing out the history of the Satanic Panic series of episodes, I realized that I had mentioned the Attorney General of Massachusetts as being one of the loudest voices from the law enforcement sector during the Satanic Panic, with one case in particular that turned out to be a big black eye, not only for the Attorney General, but for the entire state of Massachusetts and law enforcement in general when it came to the Satanic Panic. The story is incredibly interesting, and I believe it's worth telling. So, if you'll indulge me a bit further, as I give one final tug on the thread of the 1980s Satanic Panic. The story of the Fells Acres Day School scandal began quietly enough with a mother who grew concerned about her child's behavior after the child had spent the day at the daycare. The child, a 4-year-old boy, had exhibited some signs of anxiety and distress, which the mother interpreted as potential indications of sexual abuse. At the time, as discussed, the nation was in the midst of an epidemic of fear over child abuse, particularly in daycare settings. The McMartin preschool case in California, one of the first and most widely publicized cases of alleged ritualistic child abuse, was already making national headlines, stoking fears that organized satanic cults were preying on children under the guise of daycare centers. The boy's mother brought her concerns to the attention of authorities, and soon the Malden Police Department and the Massachusetts Department of Social Services were involved. The child, like so many in other cases across the country, was subjected to repeated interviews with social workers and psychologists, each time being asked to recount what might have happened to him at the daycare. The methods used in these interviews, leading questions, suggestive language, persistent probing, would later be widely criticized, but at the time, they were considered cutting-edge techniques for uncovering repressed memories of abuse. As the boy's story began to take shape, it grew more and more, fantastical. He claimed that Gerald Emerald, known as Tukey to the children, had sexually abused him in bizarre and terrifying ways. The details included not just physical abuse, but also strange ritualistic elements. Puppets, magic rooms, the use of a, quote, magic wand. The boy's account, while disjointed and inconsistent, was enough to alarm investigators, and soon other children from the daycare were being questioned. The interviews with other children followed the same pattern, repeated, suggestive questioning that slowly elicited more and more elaborate allegations of abuse. Many of the children initially denied any wrongdoing at Fells Acres, but under the pressure of multiple interviews, some began to tell stories that mirrored the boys' initial claims. In the minds of the investigators and the parents, this was seen as proof that something deeply sinister had occurred at the daycare. By the fall of 1984, the investigation had reached a fever pitch. Gerald Emerald was arrested in September, accused of multiple accounts of sexual abuse and the horrifying crime of involving children in his satanic rituals. His mother, Violet, his sister, Cheryl, were also arrested not long after, also accused of participating in the abuse. The charges against the Emerald family were staggering in their scope. Dozens of counts of child molestation, indecent assault, and battery. The allegations, drawn from the often inconsistent and implausible stories of the children, painted a picture of the Fells Acres Day School as a den of unimaginable evil. The community of Malden was stunned. The Emeralds had long been respected and trusted members of the community, and many parents struggled to reconcile the accusations with their own experiences at the daycare. Some parents, however, were quick to believe the worst. In the charged atmosphere of the 1980s, where fear of satanic cults and child abuse was pervasive, the idea that a daycare center could be a front for such heinous activities seemed all too possible. As the case against the Emeralds gained traction, the media latched onto the story. Newspapers and television stations ran lurid headlines about the supposed satanic rituals that had taken place at Fells Acres. The details of the children's allegations, claims that Gerald had dressed up as a clown and that he had engaged in ritualistic abuse involving animals and that strange ceremonies had been performed, these were repeated without question and without evidence. In an era where sensationalism often trumped fact, the media coverage only served to inflame public fear. Meanwhile, the authorities, confident in the guilt of the Emerald family, continued to build their case. The prosecution's theory was that the daycare had been the site of an organized, secretive ring of child abusers, and that the Emeralds had engaged in ritualistic practices to frighten and control the children. The evidence, however, was alarmingly thin. No physical evidence of abuse was ever found. No corroborating witnesses ever came forward. And the children's stories, many of which had changed dramatically over a short period of time, were riddled with inconsistencies. But still, the trials of the Emerald family began in 1986, with Gerald Emerald being tried first. From the outset, the case was fraught with tension and emotion. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on the testimony of children, many of whom were now 5 or 6 years old, and the psychological experts who had interviewed them. These experts claimed that the children's reluctance to testify and their frequent inconsistencies were not signs of false accusations, but rather symptoms of trauma and repression. Isn't that convenient? The defense, led by attorney James Sultan, attempted to undermine the credibility of the children's testimony by pointing out the suggestive and coercive nature of their interviews. Sultan argued that the children had been led to say what the investigators wanted to hear, and that the stories of abuse had been implanted in their minds through repeated questioning. He also pointed to the complete lack of physical evidence, arguing that it was impossible for the alleged abuse to have taken place in the busy, open environment of the daycare without anyone noticing. But the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. With the emotional weight of the children's accusations, the jury, like much of the public, was deeply affected by the harrowing accounts of abuse, and the defense's arguments about faulty memory and coercive interviewing techniques seemed to pale in comparison to the visceral impact of the children's words. In January of 1986, Gerald Emerald was found guilty of multiple counts of child molestation and sentenced to 30 to 40 years in prison. Violet and Cheryl Emerald were tried separately later that year with the same result. Despite their protests of innocence and the lack of evidence, they too were convicted, with Violet receiving a sentence of 20 years and Cheryl 8 to 20 years. The convictions of the Emerald family were seen by many as a victory for justice, a triumph in the fight to protect children from abuse. But for others, especially those who had watched the case closely and had begun to question the methods used to obtain the convictions, the verdicts were deeply troubling. It seemed as though the desire for justice had eclipsed the need for truth, and that the Emeralds had been caught in the crosshairs of a moral panic that was sweeping the nation. In the years that followed the trials, the Fells Acres case became a flashpoint, and the growing debate over the reliability of child testimony and the methods used to investigate claims of abuse. Across the country, similar cases were beginning to unravel, as the techniques used by investigators, such as leading questions, suggestive interviewing, and the use of anatomically correct dolls, were increasingly criticized by legal experts and psychologists. The Emerald family, meanwhile, began a long and painful struggle to clear their names. Violet Emerald, a strong and resilient woman who had built Fells Acres from the ground up, maintained her innocence until her death in 1997. She spent the final years of her life in prison, separated from her family and the community she had once served. Cheryl Emerald LaFave also continued to protest her innocence, appealing her conviction at every opportunity. Her case gained national attention in 1995 when the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court overturned her conviction, citing the flawed methods used in her trial. She was released from prison in 1999 after serving 8 years. But the most complicated legal battle was that of Gerald Emerald. Despite mounting evidence that the original investigation had been deeply flawed, and despite the growing national consensus that the Fells Acres case was a miscarriage of justice, the Massachusetts legal system remained resistant to reversing his conviction. For years, Gerald languished in prison, separated from his family and burdened by the label of convicted child molester. In 2001, a Massachusetts parole board recommended that Gerald Emerald be released, citing the substantial doubt that had emerged about his guilt. But the recommendation sparked a political firestorm. Then Governor Jane Swift, facing pressure from victims' advocacy groups and a public still divided over the case, refused to commute his sentence. It was not until 2004, after serving nearly 2 decades in prison, that Gerald Emerald was finally released on parole. Yet even in freedom, he remained a convicted man, his name forever associated with the heinous crimes of which he had been accused. The Fells Acres case, like the McMartin preschool case and other similar cases of the 1980s, remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral panic and the fragility of justice in the face of mass hysteria. It serves as a stark reminder of how easily truth can be distorted when fear takes hold, and how the desire to protect the vulnerable, though noble in intent, can lead to devastating consequences when it is fueled by suspicion rather than evidence. For the Emerald family, the legacy of Fells Acres is one of enduring pain and injustice. Their lives were irrevocably altered by the accusations and convictions, and though some members of the family were eventually exonerated, the scars of the ordeal remain. Violet Emerald went to her grave without seeing her name cleared, and Gerald Emerald continues to live with the weight of a conviction that many believe to be unjust. For the nation, the Fells Acres case, and the broader Satanic Panic of which it was a major part, prompted a reevaluation of how we approach allegations of child abuse. The case exposed the flaws in the criminal justice system, particularly in the way child witnesses were handled and how evidence was gathered. It led to changes in how child testimony is treated in court and how investigators are trained to avoid leading and suggestive questioning. But it also left lingering questions about how easily society can be swept up in collective fear, and how that fear can lead to the ruin of innocent lives. Looking back on the Fells Acres case from the vantage point of the 21st century, it's easy to see the ways in which the nation was gripped by a kind of collective madness in the 1980s. The fear of satanic ritual abuse, which, again, had no basis in reality, spread like wildfire, fueled by sensationalist media reports, overzealous investigators, and a public all too willing to believe the worst. Yet the lessons of Fells Acres extend beyond the specifics of the case. They're lessons about the nature of truth, about justice, and about human judgment. They remind us that in our desire to protect the innocent, we must also guard against the temptation to rush to judgment, to allow fear and suspicion to cloud our reason. For when we fail to do so, the cost is borne not just by those who are wrongfully accused, but by society as a whole. In the end, the Fells Acres case is not just a story about one family's tragedy. It's a story about how easily the lines between good and evil, guilt and innocence, can become blurred in the face of fear, and how difficult it can be to find the truth when the stakes are so high. It's a story that should never be forgotten, for its lessons are as relevant today as they were in the 80s. And as we continue to grapple with issues of justice, fairness, and the protection of the vulnerable, the legacy of Fells Acres serves both as a warning, but also as a guide for the future. Thanks for listening. Please make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and now full episodes available on YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.